Live NFL trivia every Tuesday night on Twitch at 9 p.m. Eastern. Come show off your football knowledge and have a chance to win cash prizes. Check the link in the description to find out more. And now, on with our feature presentation. The Atlanta Falcons have been around for over 55 years at this point, and when you've been around for more than half a century, you're bound to make a few roster moves that ruffle a few feathers. You're bound to make some trades that do not look good on paper and seem highly questionable. You're bound to make some transactions that not everyone agrees with, and you're bound to make some decisions that the general population will not be okay with. This happens to every single team in football. It's just a natural part of playing the game. In the front office, you win some and you lose some. But I'm not sure there's a trade or a roster move more controversial than the one the Falcons tried during the 1968 offseason. Because in 1968, they made a trade so questionable in the eyes of a lot of people that it led to the organization being accused of racism. They made a trade so bizarre that it led to the NAACP speaking up about it. And they made a trade so weird that the Falcons actually had to put out a statement addressing the criticisms. In 1968, when the Falcons traded Ron Smith to the Los Angeles Rams, a ton of outrage ensued. And this is the story behind what has to be the most controversial trade in Falcons history. Before I talk about the trade and what led to the massive outrage that came with it, we need some context to understand just who Ron Smith is in the first place. After Smith played one season with the Chicago Bears in 1965, he was acquired by the expansion team Atlanta Falcons in 1966. Obviously, as an expansion team, the Falcons needed all the help and all the bodies they could get. And I should preface all of this by saying that the Falcons were obviously not a good team back then. In the NFL, no expansion teams are ever good in the first year, and especially back in the 1960s, no expansion team ever had success right off the bat. It took teams years and years for them to find their footing, and the Falcons were no exception, especially defensively, where they finished second to last in points allowed in 1966, only ahead of the New York Giants, and dead last in points allowed in 1967. As a side note, if you want to learn more about that atrocious 1966 Giants defense that somehow allowed over 35 points per game and made the Falcons look halfway competent by comparison, then click the card in the upper right corner. Why do I bring all this up? Because when you have a defense that bad, you're going to be returning a ton of kickoffs, since every time the other team scores, you're going to be getting the ball back. And that's where Ron Smith comes into our story. Unsurprisingly, there weren't a whole lot of bright spots on the Falcons back then, but Smith's play on special teams was one of them. He led the NFL in kick return yards in 1966. In fact, during that 1966 season, he became just the third player in NFL history to have over 1,000 kick return yards in a single season. During the 1967 season, he did it again, leading the league in this category by posting 976 yards. In the history of the NFL at that point, only 6 times had a player gone above 975 kick return yards in a single season: Abe Woodson, Mel Renfro, Clarence Childs, Kermit Alexander, and Ron Smith twice. And even though a ton of that had to do with volume numbers because of how bad the Falcons were, Smith was one of the better returners in football. In 1967, he averaged 25 yards per return, which ranked 5th in the league and ranked 4th if we exclude every player who didn't have at least 20 returns. While Smith was not a good cornerback or a wide receiver, he knew how to return kicks. However, entering the 1968 offseason, his services were not good enough for the Falcons anymore. When the 1967 season ended, even though the Falcons were once again atrocious, going 1-12-1 and finishing dead last in the league, Smith once again had a good season on special teams. By leading the league in kick return yards, he became just the 4th player in NFL history at the time to lead the league in kick return yards in consecutive seasons, joining Al Carmichael of the Green Bay Packers, Woodley Lewis of the Los Angeles Rams, and Marshall Goldberg of the Chicago Cardinals. But when the season ended, the Rams, their divisional rival in the Coastal Division, came calling. The Rams wanted a return specialist badly. While they weren't bad at all returning kicks in 1967, averaging 24 yards per return as a team, which ranked 5th in the NFL, they didn't have a true number 1 returner like Ron Smith. 6 different players returned kicks for the Rams that season, with no one returning more than 13 times. The leading returner on the Rams was Willie Ellison, who had 340 yards, which ranked 22nd in a league with 16 teams. That meant that a bunch of teams in the league had 2 returners with more yardage than any one player on the Rams. When you combine this need for a returner with head coach George Allen's philosophy of trading away every draft pick he owned, since in his eyes, picks are stupid and you don't need to build through the draft and establish veterans win you games, you can probably see where this one is going. The Rams offered the Falcons a 2nd-round pick in the 1968 draft in exchange for Ron Smith. Before I go any further, let's think about what you would do in this situation if you were a general manager and a team offered you a 2nd-round pick for your kick returner. Unless your returner is Devin Hester, I'm not sure how many of you are rejecting that trade. You're taking that trade every day of the week and twice on Sunday. Ron Smith was obviously good, but you weren't winning games with him, and he wasn't a game changer that couldn't be replaced. If you've got a kick returner in the top third of the league that brings nothing to the table otherwise, and a team offers you a second-round pick for him, you're taking the deal. And General Manager Frank Wall thought the same thing, as he shipped Smith to the Rams to acquire this pick. In a normal world, that's the end of our story. It's a trade where the Rams get a top kick returner, and the Falcons get a high draft pick. However, little did anyone know that this would turn out to be the most controversial trade in the history of the Falcons franchise. Before I go any further, and I cannot stress this enough, I just want to emphasize that these are not my thoughts on the situation at hand. This is obviously a very complex and delicate situation. I am merely presenting the facts, the arguments, and the possible counter-arguments. Again, as I said before, if I was the general manager of the Falcons in 1968, and the Rams offered me a second-round pick for my solid but not spectacular kick returner, I'm jumping all over that just purely from a football standpoint. However, in the eyes of some members of the general public, it was a lot more complicated and a lot more complex than that. Don't shoot the messenger with what I'm about to say over the next few minutes, if you know what I mean. To start off, the Falcons had the fewest number of black players of any team in the NFL. When you have a small percentage of black players but you're winning games left, right, and center, the easy argument in favor of that small percentage is that the team is winning games, and is simply picking the best players possible to round up their team, regardless of skin color. However, the Falcons were the worst team in football. They were 1-12-1 in 1967 and 3-11 in 1966, meaning that in their first two seasons, they had won just 4 out of a possible 24 games. Especially since this is a Southern team we're talking about here in the Civil Rights era, the fact that they already had poor black representation and were fielding a team mainly of white players while losing badly was not a good look in the eyes of some people. And when Ron Smith, a black player who was incredibly productive for them, got traded, it raised a few eyebrows. It raised even more eyebrows when you consider the fact that this wasn't the first time during the 1967 season and early days of the 1968 offseason that the team traded away a black player. They traded fullback Ernie Wheelwright to the New Orleans Saints, and they traded wide receiver Bernie Casey to the Los Angeles Rams. The Bernie Casey trade looks especially bad in hindsight when you consider the fact that the Falcons gave up a 3rd overall pick in the 1967 Common Draft to acquire a package of players from the San Francisco 49ers, where the main centerpiece was Bernie Casey, and they traded him away without ever playing a game. And then, Casey went on to make the Pro Bowl with the Rams that season while finishing inside the top 10 in receptions and receiving yards. As you can expect, from there, things get more complicated. In the wake of the trade, the NAACP was alarmed. A.M. Davis, who was the president of the Atlanta chapter of the NAACP, sent out a telegram stating that the community was shocked and bewildered when they found out about the trade, adding that the racial policy of the Falcons through its past and present actions is open to question. In the telegram, Davis added that the NAACP had to take this opportunity to register strong opposition to the move, and to get the Falcons to change their attitude toward black players. Safe to say, there was a lot that had been building up for a while, and this Smith trade was the straw that broke the camel's back. Naturally, the Falcons assured the NAACP that there was nothing about this move whatsoever that was racist. The team said that they did not have a racial policy, and that they would gladly sign any black players who could help the team win games. There were 6 main pieces of evidence that owner Rankin Smith and general manager Frank Wall presented, with some being iffier than others. Number 1, the Falcons had 4 players in their starting lineup who were black. While the Falcons tried to make that seem like that was a good thing, 4 starters out of 22 is not exactly a lot. And if it's 4 starters out of 25 if we include kicker, punter, and returner, and you just traded one of those starters away for a draft pick, that's not exactly the strongest argument in the book, but they do get better from here. Number 2, the Bernie Casey trade had nothing to do with the color of his skin or any racial undertones, but rather the fact that Casey refused to report to the team. There's no point in having a player around who won't play for you. Number 3, Junior Coffey was named the most valuable player on the Falcons in 1967 after racking up over 900 yards from scrimmage, and he was a black running back. Number 4, Smith was not a good receiver and was not a good cornerback. No matter where the Falcons played him, he was not good. All he offered in value was on kick returns, and that wasn't good enough, especially to reject a 2nd-round pick. Number 5, the Falcons had a full-time scout who was black, so there was at least some representation in that department. And number 6, once you get outside of the first 3 rounds of the draft, there isn't a whole lot of value, so stock up on those early picks while you can. Now, this argument doesn't entirely explain why the Falcons made 14 picks outside of the first 3 rounds the previous year, but it was something to consider. The Falcons came prepared. Smith met with the NAACP to discuss the trade, and it seemed from there as though the issue was dropped. Commissioner Pete Rozelle didn't get involved, and it couldn't find anything afterwards regarding further outrage. Once Smith explained his side and how the trade made sense from a football perspective, nothing really happened. So that raises one final question. How did this controversial trade work out for both sides? Let's start with the Falcons. They used the second-round pick on Illinois wide receiver John Wright. Considering the fact that the Falcons only had one receiver go over 300 yards in 1967, and that was a 33-year-old Tommy McDonald who had nothing left in the tank and was clearly on the decline, the pick seemed to make sense on paper. However, there's a reason you're only seeing clips of him at Illinois and with the Detroit Lions, and that's because he did nothing for the Falcons. He had no catches in 1968, then was out of the league after spending the 1969 season in Detroit. The pick was a complete bust. As for the Rams, Ron Smith made an immediate impact on special teams. He led the league in yards per return during the 1968 season by averaging a then career-high 27.6 yards per return. Even though he only lasted 2 years with the Rams, Smith would go on to have an incredible career in pro football. He played 3 seasons in Chicago, and in 1972, led the league with 30.8 yards per return, and made it to the first and only Pro Bowl of his career. Then he followed that up in 1973 by scoring 2 punt return touchdowns and leading the league in punt return average as a member of the San Diego Chargers. For an undrafted free agent to last a decade in the league and become one of the most prolific returners of his era is not too shabby, if I do say so myself. Yes, the Falcons lost this trade pretty badly in hindsight, and yes, some of the optics look pretty bad. And with all of that in mind, I'm not sure we're going to see another trade in Falcons history more controversial than that one. The Julio Jones trade raised a ton of eyebrows, and while some people accuse the Falcons of being stupid, I don't think a single reasonable person accused them of being racist like some people did back in 1968. On paper, trading away a kick returner for a second-round pick seems like a steal, but in actuality, it became one of the most controversial decisions that the Falcons ever made. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot, and be sure to check out Twitch every Monday and Tuesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes, link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at JaguarGator9, and subscribe to 60-Second NFL History on YouTube. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.